When Milton Erickson went to college, he didn't have much money, and so he heard about a situation that maybe he could get free rent in a boarding house. And the deal was this. There was a woman who ran the boarding house. She was a widow, and she took in students to rent rooms from the boarding house, and she provided room and board. She gave them some food as well. And she always offered every semester someone could live in her house for free if they would take on the task of teaching her how to read. She never learned to read. She always wanted to learn to read. And student after student, the legend goes, would come and live in her house for a semester and would fail miserably at teaching her to read. She just had a block to reading. And her story was this. She was called Ma, and it was before her husband died. It was Ma and Pa that ran the boarding house. They used to be farmers, and they sold the farm when they got at a certain age, moved into town, bought a house with their proceeds from their farm, and when he died, she started renting out rooms. And so the problem with Ma was, when she was young, her father had the idea, and this was true in some of the ancient times, that women should not, females should not learn to read. They shouldn't go to school. And so by the time she had tried to learn to read after working on the farm all her life, she just was overwhelmed by the task and developed a block. When her children were born and they went to school, they would come home and bring their texts and try and teach her how to read. But again, she would look at it and everything would start to swim around and get all confused, and they would finally give up as well. So she had this lifelong dream of learning to read. She felt, handicapped by it because so many things you need to read a little something for. So finally, Erickson heard about this, and of course, Milton Erickson likes to take on the impossible tasks, even in those early days. And so he went to the boarding house, and he made the arrangement that semester to be her free student. And he undertook to give her spelling and reading lessons, but he didn't do it the usual way. He'd heard that everybody else had tried, to do this standard kind of instruction, and he decided to come at it a different way, as Erickson usually did. And he first just told her, look, we're not going to try and teach you to read and write right away. We've got to do some preliminary work. It's like when you're growing crops on the farm, you got to prepare the field. So we're going to prepare the field. And what I want you to do is just take a pencil in your hand and a paper, and I want you to make little marks on the paper with your hands, just like a baby would when they just picked up a pencil. And just, don't try and make anything meaningful, or don't try and learn to read or write. Just make little marks on the paper. So just getting her used to doing a little of that. He said, okay, now what I'd like you to do is, you were on the farm for years, you grew up on a farm. What I'd like you to do is just start to draw common objects that you see on the farm. And he instructed her to draw a few. Draw an A-frame for, a roof. And draw a rake leaning against the side of a barn. And draw a tire that's in the yard. And then draw a tire that's half buried in the yard. And gradually he got her to make all these shapes, which she didn't realize were actually the shapes of letters. So that A-frame roof was like an A-frame. He got her to put the rake in between the A-frame roof, and that turned out to be an A. And then the half tire would be a C, and the tire would be an O. And gradually he just combined these shapes of a rake with a tire, and that would be a B or a D, depending on which side he put it on. But he didn't tell her he was getting her to draw letters. But pretty soon he steered her towards certain shapes and putting those shapes together, which made all the letters of the alphabet. And he started to put them in order. Of course, she didn't realize that she was actually learning things in order. And he said, just like on the farm, each of these little shapes has a name. So we're going to give it a name. And so he started to tell her, this one is an A, this one is a C, this one is an E, things like that. And then he said, and just like animals that kind of group together in herds or flocks, when you have a flock of chickens, you call it a flock. And he said, well, when you put some of these shapes together in the little names we give them, they have other names. And so he taught her the names. He gradually got her to write words. And then he said, just name that word. And this is the name of that word. And she had a good memory and she could memorize things. And of course, he was doing this indirect way of teaching her to read. And gradually he maneuvered her to make all these shapes, to learn the names of the clumps of shapes, which were actually words. And gradually he got her to put together a sentence. And the sentence, when she named them all and just read the names of them, she wasn't reading yet, she wasn't writing yet, she said, the sentence said, "Get going, Ma, and get me some grub." And she had told him that that's what her husband used to say every night as kind of a joke. You know, "Get going, Ma, and get me some grub." And so she had read that sentence, and as soon as she read it, she realized she'd read and she'd written. So Erickson had this brilliant thing where, you know, and that influenced me a lot, where he figured what she already knew and used the resources she already had. She already had an ability to draw a little. She already had an ability to have a good memory and to name things. And he didn't try and bring up reading and writing because that's where she had her limitations. He went instead to what her assets were and what her resources were, and he indirectly led her to learn to read and write. And he was the last student that she ever gave free room and board.